The House will be in order. Proceedings will resume on questions previously postponed. Votes will be taken in the following order. Motion to suspend the rules and pass Senate Bill 546 and House Resolution 7659. I said House Resolution. H.R. 7659. The first electronic vote will be conducted as a 15-minute vote pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20. Remaining electronic votes will be conducted as 5-minute votes. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hunt, to suspend the rules and pass Senate Bill 546, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title.
Senate 546, an act to amend the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 to authorize law enforcement agencies to use COPS grants for recruitment activities and for other purposes.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote. On this vote, the yeas are 370. The nays are 18. Two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the vote on the motion of the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Graves, to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 7659 as amended, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title.
H.R. 7659, a bill to authorize and amend authorities, programs, and statutes administered by the Coast Guard.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill as amended? Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote. all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? On this vote, the yeas. On this vote, the yeas are 376, the nays are 16. 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Are there 1 minute?
Order. If members and staff could please take your conversations off the floor. The chair will now entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
The gentleman is correct. The House is not in order. Please take your conversations off the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to honor my dear friend, Colonel Richard Julian, who passed away on May 1st. He served this country in the Tennessee Air National Guard, 134th Aerial Refueling Wing, and served for... Can y'all hold it down?
The House will be in order.
Thank you. Can I start over?
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker. I rise to honor Colonel Richard Julian, Mr. Speaker, who passed away on May the 1st. He served his country in the Tennessee Air National Guard, 134th Aerial Refueling Wing, and served for over 38 years before he retired in 2004. He then worked with me when I was Knox County Mayor and was a dear friend to me. We met at Powell Auction, and dadgummit, it was a mistake because he was talking to Jack Huddleston, and Jack invited me over. We were having a campaign baloney cutting of all things, and we became dear friends shortly after that. He had a big heart. When my daughter Isabel was singing down at the Veterans Home, she had her biological father's Navy insignia on her lapel, and Colonel Julian saw that, and he got choked up. The last conversation I had with him, he told me he was going to be waiting for me in heaven and be there waiting for me with my mom and daddy when I got there. And I want to offer my deepest condolences to his wife, Linda, and his family, his daughter, Bronwyn, and her husband, Denny, Ashley, Valissa and Warren, Charlie and Tina, his little grandson, Brady, Logan and Griffin. He and many other friends and family loved him dearly, and I know he was right with the Lord because we prayed shortly before his death, and he will be missed, but Mr. Speaker, he will not be forgotten. Thank you, Colonel Julian, for giving me a very good life, and I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield the remainder of my time.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Delaware seek recognition?
To address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I am excited that this week the House is expected to take action on the bipartisan Promoting Resilient Supply Chains Act. Supply chains are an issue that touches every American, whether they know it or not. From shortages of PPE and baby formula to lumber and glass for housing to semiconductor chips that power our cars, weakened supply chains can delay critical goods that we rely on. That's why this bill is so important. It's an issue that I've been working on since the pandemic, and Dr. Larry Bouchon and I worked tirelessly to introduce this bill after many weeks of negotiations. This legislation creates a whole-of-government approach to mapping, monitoring, and proactively strengthening our supply chains, helping us identify shocks before they occur. It enjoys the support of over 150 organizations and was passed out of committee unanimously. Making our supply chains more resilient will help us create good-paying jobs, lower costs for consumers, grow our economy, and strengthen our national security. I ask our colleagues to vote yes on this legislation, and I look forward to President Biden signing it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As America recognizes National Police Week, we show our appreciation for all the officers who serve and protect us daily while honoring those who have bravely lost their lives in the line of duty. Unfortunately, Biden and far-left Democrats' support for the defund police movement has resulted in violent crime across the country, threatening families. Corrupt Judge Merchan continues his unprofessional, incompetent witch hunt persecuting Donald Trump. Merchan incompetence inspired 100,000 people to rally for Trump in New Jersey, proving Merchan is re-electing Donald Trump. Corrupt Judge Merchan is deserving my invitation to be my guest at the Trump inauguration for his re-election success of Donald Trump. In conclusion, God bless our troops who successfully protected America for 20 years as the global war on terrorism moves from the Afghanistan safe haven to America. We do not need new border laws. We need to enforce existing border laws. Biden shamefully opens the borders for dictators as more 9/11 attacks across America are imminent, as repeatedly warned by the FBI. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio seek recognition? The gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to celebrate National Police Week. This week comes at a time where Republicans have spent the past year trying to cut local law enforcement budgets to the bone. Current Republican study committee plans threaten to cut funding for nearly 30,000 law enforcement jobs nationwide. Our police forces perform their duties with great honor and courage. However, Republican efforts to defend our local police will only make their jobs harder. I urge my colleagues to support COPS funding. Please co-sponsor our bipartisan legislation that equips our law enforcement with the tools they need to adequately address the ongoing mental health crisis in the field, in our jails, and our prisons. H.R. 3501, the Law Enforcement Training for Mental Health Crisis Response Act, will provide funding to law enforcement at all levels for responding to behavioral health crises. Our nation has a severe mental health crisis. Law enforcement officers are often the first to respond, so it's vital for them to have all the right tools and training to manage these sensitive incidents safely and effectively. A big salute To our dutiful law enforcement officers in Northwest Ohio and across our nation, we value you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize National Fentanyl Awareness Day, which was celebrated last week on May 7th. In 2023, a record number of our sons and daughters' lives were taken by opioid overdoses, the majority of which were caused by illicit fentanyl poisoning. Fentanyl poisoning is the leading cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45 and is predominantly sourced from our southwest border. This is unacceptable. We must close that southern border, but there are additional steps we can take to ensure everyone, especially our youth, are protected. I've been a long-time advocate for naloxone, an overdose reversal drug, to be available over the counter, and I'm so glad the FDA finally took this step so that more people can access this life-saving medication. As a pharmacist, I understand just how important access to naloxone is. I carry it around me in my backpack everywhere I go. I've never had to use it, and I hope I don't have to use it, but it's there in case of an emergency. I've introduced legislation, the Saving Lives in Schools Act, which would require schools to carry naloxone. Wherever you see a defibrillator, you should see naloxone. It's safe, effective, easy to use, and could save a life. The Fentanyl Awareness Day, we must band together and commit to ending the fentanyl poisoning epidemic for
time has
good.
expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to highlight Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, an annual celebration that recognizes the many historical and cultural contributions of Asian and Pacific Islander descent to the United States, from science to medicine, literature and art, sports and recreation, government and politics, activism and law. Our Asian American community is so vital to our country's success. And I would like to shine a brief light on the Asian Pacific American Chamber of Congress. Back in my home state of Michigan, I had the honor of celebrating their 23rd annual anniversary and gala that included so many constituents, leaders from throughout Michigan, and yet again, Michigan continues to lead the way alongside our AAPI community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to celebrate 50 years of the Center Area Transportation Authority, or CATA. For the last 50 years, CATA has connected the Borough State College and surrounding townships with reliable transportation. Whether you're a college student looking to run errands or a full-time resident relying on CATA to help you get to your job, you can count on the bus to get you where you need to go. Mr. Speaker, as State College continues to grow, so did CATA's services. Originally starting out as the Nittany Transit Company and growing to CATA in 1974. Today, CATA continues to develop and provide for residents. CATA remains a premier small transit system and is continually recognized for their growth, service, and ingenuity. I congratulate CATA on 50 years of dedicated service to the community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, it is with great respect that I rise today in recognition of National Police Week. Every day, our brave law enforcement officers respond at a moment's notice to keep our community safe and secure. We have the responsibility to make sure they have the support and financial resources that they need to protect themselves and to perform their duties to the best of their abilities. That is why, throughout my time as a member of Congress, I have been proud to successfully secure community project funding requests in appropriation measures for police departments throughout Northwest Indiana, including most recently for Gary, Hammond, Maryville, Michigan City, and Munster. Let us continue to build this success and support our law enforcement officers and their families, not just during Police Week, but every day throughout the year. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise with a heavy heart to recognize the service of Officer Jacob Durbin and to celebrate his life while responding to a disturbance. Officer Durbin gave the ultimate sacrifice when he was ambushed and killed in the line of duty last Sunday. Mr. Speaker, from Brooklyn Heights, Jacob had joined the Euclid Police Department less than a year ago after serving in the Army National Guard. He protected his family, his country, his community. Officer Durbin's fellow officers will remember him as an incredible person with a great heart and an incredible smile. I echo Ohio Attorney General Yost in saying, it is a cruel irony that a mother lost her son on Mother's Day and that this murder happened just as we begin to solemnize our fallen during Police Week. I am grateful for the service of our law enforcement officers who have put their lives on the line every single day to protect us. My deepest condolences go to the family, friends, and fiancé of Officer Durbin and to the Euclid Police Department. God bless you, Euclid. God bless you, Ohio, and thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 2 years ago, a gunman drove to a black neighborhood with an assault rifle in his hand and hate in his heart, opening fire and killing 10 people in Buffalo, New York. He was radicalized by the Great Replacement Theory, a white supremacist, racist, anti-Semitic conspiracy. We are still mourning the 10 souls lost to this senseless violence. The only way to move forward is to acknowledge that what is killing us in droves is hatred and continued white supremacy. Congress cannot continue to ignore these hateful and discriminatory ideologies that are being promoted by far-right MAGA extremists. I introduced a resolution to condemn the Great Replacement Theory, racism, anti-Semitism, hatred, and bigotry in all its forms. We must stand up together and say clearly that white supremacy is an existential threat. We also need reparations for the black community in Buffalo and around the country, like food justice for community members and free mental health to support and address community trauma. I urge my colleagues to join me in condemning the Great Replacement Theory, repairing the harms of white supremacy, and fighting to root out hatred once and for all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, after putting on a bulletproof vest, I hopped in a police cruiser to help patrol the town. Joining Snow Hill Police Chief Josh Smith for a ride-along was enlightening. During our patrol, Chief Smith and I spoke about equipment needs, funding challenges, and staffing issues police officers face. We also took a moment to connect with our community, waving at kids skateboarding and passing by Mima's house to make sure she was okay. Dedicated officers work hard daily. Indeed, they are the backbone of our communities. As we observe National Police Week, let us recognize the bravery and sacrifice of our law enforcement personnel. Thank you, Chief, and to all the men and women who faithfully protect and serve communities across Eastern North Carolina and the nation. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 9th, 2023, the gentleman from New York, Mr. D'Esposito, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on the topic of this special order.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Beginning on Sunday evening, the United States of America welcomed thousands upon thousands of men and women who wear the uniform, who protect and serve their communities throughout this country. Mr. Speaker, Police Week 2024 welcomes law enforcement professionals from every corner of this great nation. And some are here to share important information. Some are here for training. Some are here for camaraderie. We have members of the Nassau County Emerald Society here celebrating their 50th anniversary. But the main reason we are here, Mr. Speaker, the key to why thousands upon thousands traveled to Capitol Hill for Police Week is to recognize, to remember, and to honor the men and women of law enforcement who have laid down their life for the sake of others. Just last week, we gathered here on the House floor, paying honor to Syracuse police officer Michael Jensen and Onondaga County Sheriff's Lieutenant Michael Husak. We also pay tribute to law enforcement officers in North Carolina who on Monday, April 29th, 2024, experienced the deadliest attack on law enforcement since 2016, when Joshua Iyer, Thomas Weeks Jr., Alden Elliott, and Sam Palouche died and were killed in the line of duty. And Mr. Speaker, just minutes ago, the FBI released their 2023 law enforcement officers killed or assaulted report, and there were 60 who were killed or assaulted in the line of duty across this country. You see, Mr. Speaker, we are here on Capitol Hill for Police Week to honor the more than 26,000 law enforcement officers that have died or been killed in the line of duty since 1786. Mr. Speaker, 136 law enforcement officers died in the line of duty in 2023, and their names forever etched on the wall at the Law Enforcement Officers Memorial just blocks from here. Mr. Speaker, I was proud before coming to Congress to serve in what some would argue the greatest police department in the world, the New York City Police Department. And I had the honor to serve with some of the best, the greatest detectives as an NYPD detective. But Mr. Speaker, last year, 5,363 of my brothers and sisters from the NYPD were injured on the job. The NYPD PBA president, Patrick Hendry, has been quoted as calling assaults on the NYPD a, quote, full-blown epidemic. The 5,363 of my brothers and sisters that were assaulted or attacked in 23 was 13% higher than the previous year. Mr. Speaker, there are many reasons as to why we could argue that that number continues to rise. But I think all one would have to do is turn on the news or scroll through social media or perhaps listen to news radio. You see, radical protests, an influx of criminal migrants at the hands of the Biden border crisis, cashless bail and criminal justice reform, which has been a complete failed policy of Democrats in the New York State legislature, starting with our governor and working its way down through the Senate and the Assembly. It has failed New Yorkers. And it failed in places just like here in Washington, D.C. And what do these places have in common where we see criminals having more rights than law-abiding citizens? What is the common denominator in communities and cities and counties throughout this country that have emboldened criminals, that have legitimately taken the handcuffs that are on the gun belt of law enforcement officers, and those handcuffs are now being utilized against police, not allowing them to do their job, not allowing them to go out there and live out the oath to protect and serve. And Mr. Speaker, what do those places have in common? They are governed by Democrats, radical Democrats who continue each and every day to put criminals ahead of law-abiding citizens. You see, we've seen the increase in police assaults. We've seen the increase in police officers being killed. Why? Because of radical protests, an influx of criminal migrants, bail reform, cashless bail, criminal justice reform, anti-cop rhetoric, and soft on crime, rogue district attorneys like Alvin Bragg in Manhattan. 1,287 of my brothers and sisters throughout this country died from suicide between 2016 and 2022. Mr. Speaker, that number is startling. And there are many reasons as to why we see law enforcement officers struggle. And it's one of the reasons as to why I'm working with my colleagues to erase that stigma and to make law enforcement officers realize that there is help available and that their mental health is so critically important. But we cannot put our head in the sand. We cannot ignore the fact that law enforcement officers are seeing even more stress because of the failed policies of so many so-called leaders throughout this country. Law enforcement work is challenging and dangerous. And very often we hear a police officer responded to a routine 911 call. Mr. Speaker, and to those listening at home, no 911 call is routine. No car stop is routine. Mr. Speaker, just months ago, police officer Jonathan Diller of the NYPD was out doing what he does best, taking illegal firearms off the street. And him and his team stopped a car, which for most would probably seem like a routine car stop. Someone sitting in a bus stop. Police officer Diller exited, approached the car, and was met with bullets from an illegal firearm carried by an individual who was arrested 21 times prior. Mr. Speaker, the individual who murdered police officer Jonathan Diller was arrested over 20 times and let back out on the street to commit more crimes. That individual should have rotted in a cell. And I pray that prosecutors give him that destiny. Because Jonathan Diller went to work that morning, put on his bulletproof vest, and went out to the streets of the city of New York to reduce crime, to make life safer for everyday New Yorkers. And he was murdered by a career criminal who should have been behind bars. And in a split second, a family was destroyed. And Jonathan Diller's son will wake up every single day for the rest of his life without his father. Jonathan's widow, Stephanie, will wake up every single day without her husband. And Mr. Speaker, we are gathered here in Washington, D.C. for Police Week to remember people, heroes, just like Jonathan Diller. And at Jonathan's funeral, when he was posthumously promoted to detective first grade, his wife spoke from the altar and said that 2 years earlier she listened in on the funeral of 2 other NYPD officers who were murdered and thought to herself, something needs to change. The laws in New York need to change. And she stood on that altar eulogizing her hero husband, pleading with elected officials in New York State to rethink their justice reform and cashless bail. But unfortunately, it's not going to change because Democrats in New York have doubled down. You see, I made a promise when I was sworn into the New York City Police Department. I put my hand up and took an oath. I took an oath to protect and serve the Constitution. I took an oath to protect and serve the city of New York, but I also made a promise. I made a promise in my heart to never, ever forget the men and women who I had the honor to serve with, who made the ultimate sacrifice. And that day at that funeral, I made that same promise to Detective First Grade Jonathan Diller that I would make sure we never forget him, and we won't. And I am thankful that I have colleagues on both sides of the aisle here tonight to pay tribute to law enforcement officers throughout this country. And I urge all of you to visit the memorial just blocks away and read a quote below the statue of the lion when you enter that memorial. It says, they died that made. He went to the hospital where they said he wasn't expected to live. But Stephen McDonald fought back every single day. His wife Patty Ann prayed by his bedside. His son Connor, my good friend, was baptized at his hospital bed. And Stephen McDonald spent his life advocating for the New York City Police Department and for law enforcement officers throughout this country. And he talked about peace and forgiveness and forgave his near assassins. And Stephen McDonald, who was from the 4th Congressional District, just a couple of weeks ago, I got to witness his son promoted to captain of the New York City Police Department. And Connor continues to preserve the legacy of his great father, Stephen. Mr. Speaker, another example of it's not how he died that made him a hero, it's how Stephen McDonald lived that made him a hero. So we are gathered here in Washington, D.C. for Police Week to honor those men and women who are heroes, because we promised to never forget. And now, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to my good friend and fellow brother in blue, Mr. Rutherford from Florida.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. As a law enforcement officer, my fundamental duty is to serve mankind. to safeguard lives and property, to protect the innocent against deception, the weak against oppression or intimidation, and the peaceful against violence and disorder, and to respect the constitutional rights of all men to liberty, equality, and justice. Mr. Speaker, that is the opening line of the Law Enforcement Officers Code of Ethics, a code every officer whose name is etched into the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial lived and died by. Today, I rise to honor 2 fallen police officers from my district whose names were added to the memorial wall this year. Thank you. Sergeant Michael Paul Kunovich and Deputy Sheriff Peter Thomas Johnson. Mr. Speaker, on Friday, May 19, 2023, following an arrest of a combative suspect armed with a knife, Sergeant Michael Paul Kunovich suffered a fatal heart attack from the physical exertion and stress caused while apprehending this fleeing suspect. Sergeant Kunovich served 26 years in the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office, receiving numerous awards, including a meritorious award and service award in 2023 and 2013, and an exceptional service award in 2010, and many letters of commendation. He also served on the SWAT team for 5 years while earning his bachelor's degree in public administration from Flagler College. Through and through, Sergeant Kunovich was a servant leader, dedicated to protecting his community until the end of his watch. He will be greatly missed by the whole Northeast Florida law enforcement community. My thoughts and prayers are with his family, including his 2 sons, Michael Jr. and Max, his friends, and the men and women of the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office. I also rise today to honor the life and service of Deputy Sheriff Peter Thomas Johnson, who was shot and killed while investigating reports of a firearms discharge on December 21st, 1913. That's right, 1913. You see, Mr. Speaker, Deputy Johnson served with the Duval County Sheriff's Office for 11 months before his end of watch over 110 years ago. But until this year, he had never been recognized. We are forever grateful for his service and the heroic legacy that he left behind. You know, we promise our officers every day, as has been said so eloquently by my colleague here, that we will never forget. And this is evidence tonight that we will never forget if an officer is called upon to lay down that full measure of devotion. Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, "The purpose of life is not to be happy. It's to be useful. It's to be honorable, to be compassionate, to have it make some difference that you lived and lived well." Mr. Speaker, these 2 men that we honor tonight lived well. May these heroes never be forgotten. Mr. Speaker, as a law enforcement officer for over 40 years, including 12 years as Sheriff of Jacksonville, I've dedicated my life to protecting and serving my Northeast Florida community alongside some of the finest men and women. And now it is my job in Congress to call on protecting those men and women who are serving today. Anyone who has put on a badge and answered the call of duty knows the dangers that may await. And sadly, this is the reality officers and their families accept each time they leave home. In 2023, with a 30% increase in ambushing of law enforcement officers, 378 law enforcement officers were shot in the line of duty, compared to 331 in 2022. That's a 13% increase in just 1 year. These attacks must end. That's why I introduced the Protect and Serve Act, a bipartisan bill to increase penalties on those who want to target and ambush and harm our police officers. And I urge Congress to pass it. If these bad actors want to target the police, we in Congress should target them. It's our responsibility to protect those who protect us. As anyone who has worked in law enforcement knows, losing a loved one, a colleague, or a friend in the line of duty changes you forever. I know what officers go through every day as they put on their uniform and say goodbye to their families. During my over 40-year career, I lost 26 colleagues and friends who laid down their lives in service to our community. One police officer killed in an ambush is one too many. The increase in ambushes and dangerous rhetoric about law enforcement has left many agencies struggling now to hire and retain the best and the brightest. We must help give agencies the tools they need to hire and keep these officers. That is also why I introduced the HELPER Act, a bicameral bipartisan bill that I introduced in the House to make it easier for police officers and other public servants in our community to buy their first home. Families everywhere are struggling to get by. In fact, many of our nation's first responders and teachers are priced out of the very neighborhoods that they are called to serve. By making home ownership easier, the HELPER Act would work to boost the recruitment and retention of our dedicated public servants and help make our communities safer. Everyone benefits from being neighbors with those serving and protecting our way of life. I urge the House to pass these important bills to make our communities safer and deliver for our law enforcement officers nationwide. Mr. Speaker, I just hope that and pray that all of us can lead lives that are worthy of their sacrifice. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rutherford. I now yield 3 minutes to my friend from New Jersey and the co-chair of the Law Enforcement Caucus, Mr. Pascarell.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm always proud to stand in support of our brave law enforcement officers who suit up every day. That is especially true during National Police Week. This year, National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial will add 282 names of officers who have died in the line of duty. I'm thinking of my good friend, Passaic County Sheriff Richard Burdick, a dedicated public servant. We will never forget his sacrifices that made our community a better place. As longtime chair of the co-chair of the Law Enforcement Caucus, I know any successful effort to fund and support the police must be bipartisan. I'm deeply disappointed to see law enforcement politicized these last several years. We must stand united against all attacks on police, not just certain attacks, all attacks. That includes our brothers and sisters working for federal agencies, too. Many times are forgotten. When I say all attacks, I mean even the attacks on January 6, 2021. You don't need a cannon on the front lawn of the capital of the greatest country in the world to say there is actions against our police and law enforcement, because there was no cannon on the front lawn that day. So this is Police Week. This is Police Week that can be any week in our society. It should be every week. The respect that we show for those people who protect our lives day in and day out. I'm proud of the bipartisan solutions we've enacted to improve the physical and mental health of our officers. Same thing with our firefighters. In 2015, we enacted the Bipartisan National Blue Alert Act to protect law enforcement officers who become targets of violent criminal attacks. This law has resulted in 37 states developing Blue Alert plans to help catch those who seek to hurt our police. In 2019, we permanently authorized the life-saving Bulletproof Vest Partnership Grant Program. Vests are directly attributable to saving the lives of over 300 officers in the last 10 years. And last Congress, I introduced the Law Enforcement Training Act, which authorized $270 million to support officer counseling and training for addressing mental health. It cannot be a stigma, and we need to address it. And it should be something that someone comes forth with to seek help. And we have to create that environment within our departments and within our society. This Police Week, let us do right by law enforcement communities. Let us pass bills that actually fund the police, not words, but action. Frankly, I regret that each of the police bills coming to the floor this week are more partisan and political than the next. Take a look at them, read them. Conversely, across the building, I'm glad to see the Senate acting by advancing Honoring Our Fallen Heroes Act. This bill would ensure first responders who die or become disabled from occupational cancer get their public safety officers' benefits. This builds on the bill to reform and expand federal death and disability benefits that we passed during Police Week in 2021. Pay, benefits, health care, housing assistance, fair retirement treatment, bills addressing these items can make a real difference for our officers and their families. I hope we can get the Honor Act and other important priorities to the President's desk this Congress. Thank you, and God bless our police, and God bless our America. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. And I was hoping that tonight was about honoring, but if we want to, I guess, talk about the bills that are on the floor this week, we could do that prior to debating. But to say that the bills this week are partisan, that they're supporting law enforcement, I would have to disagree. I mean, one of them I actually wrote myself, and it is about providing law enforcement, the law enforcement officers who are actually being attacked in city streets like New York by illegal migrants. The bill requires that law enforcement agencies throughout the country are given updates as to how this migrant crisis, the Biden border crisis, how it's affecting law enforcement so that Congress and local municipalities can do the job that they need to make sure that law enforcement has the resources they need to protect themselves. That does not seem partisan to me. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to another brother in law enforcement, my good friend from Minnesota, Mr. Stauber.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague from New York, Congressman D'Esposito, for leading this important conversation this evening. I am proud to stand here in this hallowed institution on Police Week to honor my brothers and sisters in law enforcement. As a police officer with over 20 years of experience, I know firsthand the sacrifices law enforcement officers make for the safety and security of their communities. Policing is a noble and honorable profession, and it can be a dangerous one. However, in the years since I have left the profession, there has been a dramatic increase in violent attacks on law enforcement. In 2023 alone, as previously stated, 378 police officers were shot in the line of duty, the highest number ever recorded. This increase in violence against law enforcement is the direct result of the extreme Democrats' disastrous defund the police movement, soft on crime policies, and activist prosecutors that have emboldened violent criminals and allowed them to remain free. In my colleague's state of New York, we recently lost Officer Jonathan Diller, who was killed by a career criminal who had been released from jail 21 times. 21 times. Let that sink in for a moment. I watched the eulogy given by Officer Diller's widow, Stephanie, in which she asked a heartbreaking and a very powerful question. She asked, how many more officers have to make the ultimate sacrifice before we start protecting them? Similar questions have been echoed by the law enforcement officers in my home state of Minnesota, where Burnsville police officers Paul Elmstrand, Matthew Ruge, and firefighter-paramedic Adam Finseth were recently gunned down responding to a domestic crisis. Much like New York, Minnesota is filled with officials who have a soft-on-crime, anti-law enforcement agenda. And there is no better example of this dysfunction than the Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty, who is consistently handing out lenient sentences to violent criminals. In one particular egregious case, she attempted to give someone who had committed murder a sentence of 2 years in a rehabilitation program. Meanwhile, Ms. Moriarty is leading a political prosecution against a Minnesota state trooper who acted heroically and lawfully to save the life of his partner. Mr. Speaker, I am sick and tired of seeing people in power attacking our law enforcement heroes while going easy on criminals who wreak havoc in our communities. Because of these continued attacks on law enforcement by criminals and elected officials, we are unable to attract young people to the policing profession. Meanwhile, more and more officers are retiring early from the force. This has, of course, allowed crime to skyrocket, leaving remaining officers and the communities they swore to protect less safe. On National Police Week, I demand that all of our nation's leaders do a better job standing up against the ugly attacks on law enforcement. There are too many politicians who are all too eager to show up to the funerals of our fallen heroes while doing absolutely nothing to protect the brave men and women who remain in this noble profession. We have a responsibility to defend those who defend us. So with that said, I ask all of my colleagues in this chamber to consider Stephanie Diller's questions once more. How many more officers have to make the ultimate sacrifice before we start protecting them? Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to Mr. Baird from Indiana.
I thank my colleague for yielding me this time. And Mr. Speaker, every day our men and women in blue, they leave their homes and their families and not knowing whether they'll return. This is a heartbreaking reality that we do not give enough credit to. These heroes selflessly go out into our communities every day to ensure the safety of their families, their friends, and strangers that they do not know, and ask for nothing in return. Mr. Speaker, this year alone, 98 officers were killed in the line of duty. That's 98 too many. One of them is Deputy Sheriff Fred Fisler of Hendricks County, Indiana. Deputy Fisler's life tragically ended on April 16, 2024, while he responded to a deadly car crash. Officer Fisler is survived by his wife and 2 children. I pray for his family and every other officer who has been killed in the line of duty. They sacrificed their lives for our safety. As we honor their lives during National Police Week, let us not forget how we are all impacted by these unsung heroes. Whether we see it or not, we must always back the blue. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to my friend and fellow New Yorker, Mr. Williams.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, Mr. D'Esposito. I know that you speak with experience and from the heart. And I speak on behalf of this body is that I thank you for your leadership in this important area. Thank you. You know, we remember Lieutenant Michael Husak and Officer Michael Jensen tonight. God bless their families as they mourn. You know, thinking about what is it we're doing here during Police Week, my mind goes to how we can best support law enforcement through our work here in Congress. That support can take many forms, but it certainly must be more than just rhetoric. What resources do they need to carry out their work safely and successfully? The madness and stupidity of defund the police is over. In my district in Central New York, we worked through the appropriations process, keeping the needs of our district's police in top of mind. Some of the most fulfilling work I've had the honor of doing since coming to Congress has involved sitting down with local law enforcement, hearing about their needs directly from them, and advocating for them here in Washington. When you speak with these folks, you get a real sense of the gravity of their work. They know all too well that they place their lives at risk every time they clock in, and they do so for our sake. And every opportunity I get, I tell them to make sure that they go home to their family at the end of their shift. They kiss their wife and kids and be able to suit up the next day. How can we expect law enforcement to have the backs of Americans when so often politicians with a duty to represent them turn their backs on the police? When our police are facing the most difficult challenges, it's up to those with the ability to support them to do so in any capacity that they can. And I was proud to join many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle last year to pass the Police Act of 2023, which would make assaulting a law officer a deportable offense. It's a shame that the Senate has not voted on this bill for a year. Now, in my home state of New York especially, the police community has faced significant trials in recent memory. And I ask again, what more can we do? What more must we do? I call on my colleagues to offer support to those who do so much to support us. I'm honored to be here to speak on behalf of the law enforcement community today. I yield back.
I now yield 2 minutes to my friend, Mr. Guest.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. This week, National Police Week, we thank and we reaffirm our support for our peacemakers. This week, we honor those men and women who lost their lives in the line of duty, the brave men and women who serve and protect, who dedicate their lives to defending innocent citizens from those who seek to do evil, and who routinely place themselves in harm's way. They are the heroes we call in our time of need. President Ronald Reagan once said, "There can be no more noble vocation than the protection of one's fellow citizens. No single group is more fully committed to the well-being of their fellow Americans and to the faithful discharge of duty than our law enforcement personnel. In the performance of their duties, danger is a routine part of their job, and we on occasion lose some valiant men and women. Mr. Speaker, let us never forget those that have paid the ultimate sacrifice in service to their fellow man. And let the families of our fallen officers be comforted by the words in the Gospel of John. John 15:13. Greater love has no man than this, to lay down his life for another. May we never forget our heroes and their sacrifice. I yield back.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as was said, we gathered over the last few days and will continue to gather this week for Police Week to honor men and women throughout this great nation who have worn the uniform, who kissed their loved ones goodbye and never came home. People like Detective Jonathan Diller. Heroes like Patrick Rafferty, like Paul Tuzzolo. I actually met with Eileen Rafferty and Lisa Tuzzolo today. Two women who didn't know each other, but have now formed a beautiful bond. Not a bond out of happiness, but a bond from losing their husband. Losing their husbands on the streets of New York City. Both to illegal firearms. Murdered and taken from this world because they wore the uniform. Lisa and Eileen made their trip to Washington, D.C. this week from New York, not by train, not by bus, not by air, but by bike. They pedaled from Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan. They pedaled their way here to Washington, D.C. and arrived at the Law Enforcement Officers Memorial. And they did it to continue to honor their husbands. They did it with other line of duty families who are honoring their loved ones. So that's what this week is about. It's about raising awareness to the dangers that members of law enforcement face each and every day. It's about raising awareness to the fact that in places like New York, Democrats have made the jobs and the lives of law enforcement less safe. We heard it from the widow of Jonathan Diller, who was pleading during her eulogy for elected officials to do something. Mr. Speaker, I am thankful, truly thankful, to my colleagues who came this evening to not just pay tribute to individuals from their district, but to pay tribute to law enforcement throughout this country. And I have to disagree with my friend on the other side of the aisle who talked about the bills this week being partisan, because I look at them as a way to keep this community safe, this country safe. Mr. Van Drew's Detain and Deport Illegal Aliens Who Assault Cops Act. Well, we've seen it on the streets of New York City, cops being assaulted in broad daylight by illegal migrants from the Biden border crisis. Or how about the Police Our Border Act, my piece of legislation that will authorize the Justice Department to provide information to law enforcement agencies throughout this country about the migrant crisis so that law enforcement has the resources they need to be safe. Or legislation from Don Bacon that broadens the ability of qualified, trained, active and retired law enforcement officers to carry firearms. That is not partisan. That is giving trained law enforcement professionals the right to carry and broaden their right to carry firearms. The D.C. Crimes Act of 2024, from my good friend Byron Donalds, allows Congress to exert their oversight power over the D.C. Council and promote safety in Washington, D.C. The common denominator again in D.C. is it's led by radical Democrats who have made this nation's capital less safe. That's not partisan. It's actually common sense. Or Mr. Bishop's Improving Law Enforcement Officer Safety and Wellness Through Data Act, which requires the Attorney General to assemble reports on violence against law enforcement officers. Requires the Attorney General to assemble reports on violence against law enforcement officers. Mr. Speaker, I don't see how that's partisan. It's about keeping law enforcement safe. That's not a Republican issue. It's not a Democrat issue. It's a United States of America issue. Or my brother in blue, Clay Higgins, which condemns President Biden's border crisis and the burdens it has created for America's law enforcement officers. That's not partisan. The facts and the data tell the story. Joe Biden and Secretary Mayorkas have allowed millions of illegal migrants into this country. They have been arrested for assaulting and attacking law enforcement. Again, not partisan. Attacking law enforcement is not a Republican concern or a Democrat concern. It's an American people concern. Or the resolution by Mr. Stauber regarding violence against law enforcement officers. 374 officers killed since 2021. Record-breaking 378 officers shot in the line of duty in 2023, a 60% increase since 2018. The NYPD estimates record number of assaults on officers for 2023. So that doesn't seem partisan either. So, Mr. Speaker, we gather here this week to recognize and remember men and women who have made the ultimate sacrifice. We also gather to raise awareness that law enforcement in this country is under attack. And they are under attack because there are reckless policies and laws being put in place promoting a far-left agenda that emboldens criminals and restricts law enforcement from doing the job they took the oath to do. That's what Police Week is about. And as I just read down that line of legislation that Speaker Johnson and Leader Scalise and Whip Emmer and our conference chair, Elise Stefanik, have put on the agenda for this week, I find my colleagues' comment that they are partisan even more ridiculous. Because as I read through each piece of that legislation right now, it's a common sense approach. It's about standing with law enforcement. It's about giving them the tools and the resources that they need to give their job. And Mr. Speaker, that is not a partisan issue. Every piece of legislation on the floor this week should have every vote of every member of this chamber. So, Mr. Speaker, again, I thank my colleagues from both sides of the aisle for being here this evening, for saluting heroes, for welcoming men and women in blue from throughout this country to their offices and to this Hill this week. I truly mean when I say thank you from the bottom of my heart. I speak to the children and the widows. This week matters to them. It matters to the men and women right now who are in locker rooms throughout this country, suiting up for their night out on the street. It matters that we stand with them. So, Mr. Speaker, thank you. And I leave you with, it's not how they died that made them heroes. It's how they lived. Mr. Speaker, I thank you. May they all rest in peace. And they remain the motto of the New York City Police Department, Fidelis ad mortem, faithful unto death. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 9th, 2023, the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Sherfilis McCormick, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the subject of this special order hour.
Without objection.
It is with great honor that I rise today as co-anchor of this CBC Special Order Hour, along with my distinguished colleague, Representative Jonathan Jackson. For the next 60 minutes, members of the CBC have an opportunity to discuss the importance of the 70th anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education, an issue of great importance to the Congressional Black Caucus, Congress, the constituents we represent, and all Americans. Today I rise to reflect upon the 70th anniversary of one of the most pivotal moments in our nation's history, the landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education. This ruling forever altered the course of our nation, shattering the chains of segregation and paving the way for more just and equitable society. Our educational institutions were mirrored by racial segregation, denying countless Black children the opportunity to receive a quality education simply because of the color of their skin. The Brown versus Board of Education decision struck down the doctrine of separate but equal, declaring that segregated education facilities were inherently unequal, thus unconstitutional. This ruling not only dismantled the legal framework of segregation in schools, but sent a powerful message that discrimination and inequality have no place in our society. But the significance of Brown versus Board of Education extends far beyond the realm of education. It laid the groundwork for a more inclusive and equitable society, one in which every individual is afforded the same right and opportunities regardless of race, creed, or background. It ignited a spark of change that reverberated throughout the nation, catalyzing the civil rights movements and inspiring generations of activists to fight for equality and justice. It emboldened individuals to challenge institutionalized racism and discrimination in all of its forms, paving the way for monumental legislative victories, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Today, we can see the impact of Brown versus Board of Education in every corner of our nation. It has transformed our economy, unleashing the untapped potential of millions of African Americans who now have the opportunity to pursue their dreams and contribute to the prosperity of our country. It has strengthened our social fabric, fostering greater understanding and empathy among people of different races and backgrounds. It has reaffirmed our commitment to the principles of justice and equality that lie at the heart of our democracy. But our work is far from over. Despite the progress we have made, we still face inequalities that divide our society. The legacy of Brown versus the Board of Education reminds us that the fight for civil rights is ongoing and that we must remain vigilant in our pursuit of a more perfect union. So let us honor this legacy by redirecting ourselves to the cause of justice and equality. Let us continue to strive for a future where every child, regardless of their race or background, has the opportunity to succeed and thrive. And let us never forget the power of our collective voices to bring about meaningful change in our communities and in our nation. I'd like to now yield to my co-anchor, Representative Jonathan Jackson from Illinois.
I would like to thank the Honorable Congresswoman Sheila Scherflus McCormick from Florida and the co-anchor of this special order hour. Thank you, Congresswoman McCormick. Tonight, just a few of my colleagues and I gather in this place and at this time to remind the members of this body and the American people of the cost of progress in this country. I submit to you that there are too many people who have come to believe that progress is inevitable, that history is slanted upward, and that if left to its own devices, this country will magically always do the right things. And it is not ironic that those are usually also the same people who believe that marches and demonstrations are untimely and excessive. In a very real sense, these are the people who said that Reverend Martin Luther King was a rabble-rouser, that Thurgood Marshall was delusional, that college protests are inconveniences and not to be taken seriously, that the preservation of the status quo is of more social value than is the expansion of opportunity and liberty, and that they do further believe that public demonstrations of discontent are more about law and order than about the irrepressible yearning in every human being to unapologetically be free. What they miss is that all of us want and deserve is to be treated with respect and have our dignity intact. What they fail to realize is that all of us want to see our children live in communities where they are safe and valued and have opportunity. But regrettably, not all of us have access to the things that make for peace. In the words of Reverend Martin Luther King, peace is not the absence of noise, but it's the presence of justice. Not all of us are judged by the content of our character, nor simply the color of our skin. And not as long as every child in Brooklyn cannot read, and every child in Atlanta and the Appalachians may not have a desire to learn, we cannot be complacent in a nation of great wealth. What the purveyors of inevitability fail to understand is that freedom and justice have never come to those who waited for someone else to decide it was time for them to be free. Even in this body, there are far too many individuals under the impression that this nation will become a more perfect union if we just leave things alone. But nothing could be further from the truth. Today and this week, we commemorate the 70th anniversary of Brown versus the Board of Education. And what made this a landmark decision was not just that it undermined the fallacious reasoning that made segregation possible in this country, but also the fact that the decision itself was the result of generations of American citizens working diligently in the shadows of American history to push this nation forward. Brown versus the Board of Education didn't just happen 70 years ago. An entire movement made it possible for the Supreme Court not to ignore the arrival of an idea whose time had come.
We are only able to have this commemoration because black people and honorable white people in this country refuse to wait another generation before we can enjoy some of the promises of America. And what happened in that courtroom in 1954 in Arkansas cannot be understood apart from what is happening in the streets of America today. Progress in America is a fact that cannot be denied, but it did not happen because America wanted to change. This nation is not a better place to live in because Southern segregationists changed their minds. Change happened in America because though the wheels of God grind slow, they grind exceedingly small but forward. That is to say, it was nothing but the righteous indignations of ordinary people doing extraordinary things that made justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Just the other day, not far from here in the Capitol, in Statuary Hall, we celebrated the statue of Daisy Bates, taking her rightful place in Statuary Hall. As a child, I grew up in Chicago, and Mrs. Bates oftentimes came and shared the holidays with my family. It was indeed an honor to be a member of the 118th Congress and to see the unveiling of her statue. An African-American woman who at the age of 8 had lost her mother to men that had raped her and killed her and put her in a mill pond in Arkansas, never having faced justice. But to see President Bill Clinton and Governor Mike Huckabee unveil a statue and a highway, a road in her honor, was truly an honor in 1998. As we celebrate the valorization and veneration of her likeness, I would remind us of how many different kinds of people it takes to move a nation forward in this direction for its principles on paper. Daisy Bates was a publisher and an activist who gave counsel to the Little Rock Nine children that were denied access to a public education under the Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas. The Little Rock name she was someone instrumental in the effort to undermine the nation's separate but legal law, a Jim Crow era law that still remained. She didn't come out of her mother's womb wanting to be an activist, but she lived in a country where activism was as much as a necessity as breathing. When our young children are gathering up on the campuses today, they yearn for freedom. So she did what she had to do for herself and her progeny. This nation owes her our deepest gratitude for laying such a costly sacrifice upon the altars of equity and equality in America. To teach and all of the remarkable trailblazers who dedicated their lives to the possibilities of unbridled opportunity in this country. We owe you, Miss Daisy Bates, our devotion, and we owe our children common sense. But do not be deceived, my friends. We still need people who are willing to do extraordinary things in the case of freedom and justice. Because when a black United States airman can be murdered in his house for expressing his Second Amendment right to bear arms, while Kyle Rittenhouse can shoot 3 people and walk down the streets with an AR-15 in his hands, and nobody even asked him a question. Clearly, there is work that still needs to be done in our country. Be not deceived, my friends. As long as women do not get equal pay for equal work, we have work to do. As long as anti-Semitism is taking on a life of its own, while anti-blackness has never truly subsided, there is still work that must be done. And we are the ones to do it. So let us continue the work. Let us continue to fight for what is right. Let us challenge our friends to do more, our enemies to do better, and ourselves to never give up. God bless the memory of all of those that kept America strong and make America better. We commemorate this day for Miss Daisy Bates and the children of Little Rock and those that brought in a new era of desegregation. I yield back to the Honorable Congresswoman Sheila Sherfless McCormick.
Thank you so much. for those eloquent words. The landmark ruling in Brown versus Board of Education not only shattered the doctrine of separate but equal, but firmly established that racial segregation is abhorrent to the principles enshrined in our Constitution. It affirmed unequivocally that every child in America, regardless of race, deserves equal protections and opportunity under law. Today, as we reflect on the pivotal moment, we are reminded of its profound impact on our journey towards civil rights and educational equality. Yet, despite the progress we have made, we must confront the realities that still persist. Inequalities that continue to hold back our youth from reaching their full potential, especially in marginalized communities. Innovation in education has been monumental, but not uniformly felt. As we grapple with the challenges of economic disparities and systemic barriers, we are called upon to what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. described as the fierce urgency of now. The fight for education opportunity and the quest for civil rights are inextricably intertwined. Focusing on education as a civil rights issue changes the cadence of our conversation. We must ensure that the promise of Brown versus Board of Education extends beyond our history and into our lives, our lived experiences of every student. Let us champion policies that foster innovation and collaboration across all sectors to create holistic solutions that uplift every child. We must secure the necessary investments to revitalize our educational system and affirm our unwavering commitment to the next generation. This is not just an educational mandate, it is a moral imperative. In addition, the economic significance of Brown versus Board of Education cannot be overstated. By dismantling the legal framework of segregation in education, it opened up doors that had long been closed to Black Americans. Education is not just a means of imparting knowledge. It is the key to economic opportunity, the gateway to prosperity. Prior to this ruling, Black students were assigned to underfunded standard schools, deprived of resources and opportunities afforded to their white counterparts. This perpetuated a cycle of poverty and limited upward mobility for generations of Black Americans. But with the desegregation of schools mandated by Brown versus Board of Education, Black students gained access to better funded schools, qualified teachers, and educational opportunities previously denied to them. This led to a buoying Black middle class and contributed to overall economic growth and prosperity for our entire nation. Yet despite the gains made since Brown, racial disparities persist in our educational system and in our economy. These disparities have far-reaching economic consequences. For example, a recent report from the National Urban League finds that racial income gaps between has been stagnant for over 20 years, with Black Americans earning an average of 64% of the income of white Americans. As we commemorate Brown versus the Board of Education, let us recommit ourselves to the unfinished work of achieving true equality in education and economic opportunity for all. Mr. Speaker, you've heard from my distinguished colleagues about the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, all issues of great importance to the Congressional Black Caucus, our constituents, Congress, and all Americans tonight. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 9th, 2023, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Kennedy, for 30 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to submit extraneous material into the record.
Without objection.
I rise this evening to mark the solemn anniversary of the racist mass shooting in Buffalo, New York. On this day, 2 years ago, good people who simply made an afternoon stop at a grocery store were gunned down in broad daylight. 10 innocent lives stolen from friends, families, and our community. It's important that their names continue to live on in our hearts and in the record. Celestine Chaney, Roberta A. Drury, Andre McNeil, Catherine Massey, Margus D. Morrison, Hayward Patterson, Aaron Salter Jr., Geraldine Talley, Ruth Whitfield, and Pearl Young. The perpetrator was not from the city of good neighbors. This racist, white supremacist intentionally came to our community and targeted the only grocery store in a predominantly black neighborhood. Every Western New Yorker remembers the first phone call we received, the horror as we realized the full extent of what had happened, and then the heartbreak of burying people whose lives were taken simply for the color of their skin. It has changed Buffalo forever. But rather than divide us, the people of Buffalo came together, as we often do during the toughest of times, embracing one another and championing for change. We prayed together. We fed our Cold Springs neighbors who were forced into a food desert with the closing of their only grocery store, and we rallied for change. My dear friend, now Buffalo Common Councilwoman Zanetta Everhart nearly lost her son, Zaire Goodman, that day. Zaire worked at Tops. He was just doing his job, helping a customer, when a bullet entered his neck. He fell to the ground, and when the shooter moved on, he was able to escape and place the most terrifying phone call of his mother's life. Miraculously, by the grace of God, Zaire is alive and thriving today. I had the privilege of joining Zanetta as she traveled right here to Washington and testified before Congress, refusing to hold back details as she explained the horror of what had happened to Zaire and the other victims. Zanetta gave powerful testimony, along with former Fire Commissioner Garnell Whitfield, whose 86-year-old mother was murdered right in front of Zaire when he was carrying her groceries to her car for her. Zanetta and Garnell were supported in their testimony by the families of the other Buffalo victims. And for the first time in 30 years, Congress acted, passing the Safer Communities Act. Still, in the 2 years since the Buffalo tragedy, senseless mass shootings have continued throughout the nation. More cities and families have endured the pain of burying their loved ones due to gun violence. We need to do better. That means passing Representative Macbeth's assault weapons ban of 2023, Representative Clyburn's Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2023, Representative Fitzpatrick's Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2023, Representative Mang's Aaron Salter Jr.'s Responsible Body Armor Possession Act, Representative Krishnamurthy's Hate Crimes Commissions Act, Representative Bowman's resolution condemning the Great Replacement Theory, and Representative Schiff's Equal Access to Justice for Victims of Gun Violence Act of 2023, just to name a few. But this package represents common sense legislation that rejects hate and will help keep weapons of war out of the hands of dangerous individuals. Public safety is not a partisan issue. Mass murders like the one that happened in Buffalo happens in red states and blue states, cities and suburbs, farming communities, schools, churches, synagogues, mosques, grocery stores, all across this nation. And it shouldn't happen at all. Further action is needed, and it's long overdue. We must find common ground to stop the pain felt by our community in Buffalo, but so many other communities across this nation. Buffalo and Western New York will continue to persevere as we always do. These past few days have been a roller coaster of emotions, to say the least. As we relive these awful moments of 2 years ago today and continue down the path of honoring and remembering the lives that were lost. On Monday, just yesterday, we unveiled the final design for the 514 Memorial that will be built in Buffalo. It's an amazing concept, and it will serve as a permanent testament to the character of our city and the beautiful commemoration of the victims of this hate crime. It features 10 interconnected pillars, each inscribed with the names of the victims and survivors. Each one unique in its arc and height, reflective of the uniqueness and irreplaceability of each of the victims. And it will feature a new building to serve as a gathering place, to bring the community together, to unite us. When it's completed, I hope my colleagues will join me to visit this moving space, this memorial, to gain a greater understanding for the loss that we've experienced and perhaps a greater commitment to preventing future tragedies. Following the shooting, an impromptu memorial sprung up at the corner of Jefferson and Landon Streets. The corner was filled with flowers, toys, photos, candles, cards, and much more. Much of that was archived at the Buffalo History Museum to make way for a permanent honor space. Today, that space at the Tops on Jefferson was dedicated, permanently commemorating the lives that were lost at that location, ensuring that the supermarket, already a neighborhood landmark, becomes a living memorial. And as we honor these beautiful souls, it's important that we take a moment to thank the brave first responders who got there almost immediately that day to secure the scene, tend to the wounded, and prevent more bloodshed. The Buffalo Police Department had the suspect in custody within 6 minutes of the first 911 call. But because of the weapons of war that this terrorist had, he was able to inflict horrible damage in a very short amount of time. These 10 people taken from us 2 years ago today aren't just statistics. They were mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, friends, leaders in our community. I'd like to take a moment to talk about each of them. Pearl Young. Pearl Young was 77 years old. Pearl was a native of Fayette, Alabama, coming to Buffalo following her marriage to Oliver Young Jr. in 1967. She was a substitute teacher, a Sunday school teacher, and an active member of the Church of God in Christ, where she helped to run the food pantry for a quarter of a century. She was the loving mother of James, Pamela, and Damon, sister of Annie Ruth Winston and Jean Craig, grandmother to 10, great-grandmother to 7, and beloved by countless nieces and nephews. Ruth Whitfield. Ruth Whitfield was 86 years old. She was a longtime parishioner at Durham Memorial AME Zion Church, where she sang in the choir. She was a devoted wife, caring for her husband and soulmate, Garnell Whitfield, of 68 years nearly every day, for 8 years in a nursing home. Everything from clipping his nails to doing his laundry, and of course, visiting him on a daily basis. She left behind her husband, Garnell Whitfield Sr., her children, Robin Harris, former Buffalo Fire Commissioner Garnell Whitfield Jr., Angela Crawley, and Raymond Whitfield. 9 grandchildren, 8 great-grandchildren, 5 great-great-grandchildren, and numerous extended family. Margus D. Morrison. Margus Morrison was 52 years old, one of 3 brothers, and graduated from Bennett High School in 1990. Margus was a bus aide for the Buffalo Public Schools Stanley Makowski Early Childhood Center. His colleagues remembered him as a punctual, reliable, and filled with a wonderful sense of humor. When he was killed, he was out buying Saturday evening dinner for his family. Margus Morrison left behind his 6 beloved children and his adored companion of the last 25 years, Regina Patterson. Andre McNeil. Andre McNeil was 53 years old and a brother to 7 siblings. He was a Buffalo native, attending South Park High School. He loved basketball, playing guitar, writing poetry, listening to music, and of course, spending time with his family, including his fiancée, Tracy Masurlovich. He was the adoring father to his 5 children, Chandra Rogers, Andrea Beckman, Leandra Elliott, Deja Brown, and Andre McNeil Jr., known affectionately as AJ. When Andre was murdered, he was out buying a birthday cake for AJ's 3rd birthday. He also left behind 8 siblings, brothers, Yvonne James Elliott, Marcus Elliott, Malik Elliott, and Jimmy Elliott, and sisters, Andrea Anna Unique Porter, Rose White, Darlissa Elliott, and Marchette Elliott, as well as 3 grandchildren, numerous aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, cousins, and friends. Aaron Salter Jr., Lieutenant Aaron Salter Jr. was 55 years old. He died a hero, delaying the shooter and giving more people precious seconds to escape. He saved lives that day. Lieutenant Salter was a retired Buffalo police officer working that day as an armed security guard. When the shooter walked in, armed with an AR-15 style rifle and clad in body armor, Lieutenant Salter didn't hesitate. He opened fire, hitting the target. But because of the shooter's body armor, he was unharmed and fired back, killing Lieutenant Salter. After Lieutenant Salter retired from the Buffalo Police Department in 2018, he began working as a security guard at Tops, where he'd engage with customers and employees, making everyone feel safe, seen, and appreciated. He was the son of Carol and Aaron Salter Sr., the husband to Kimberly, adoring father to Letitia Slaughter, Aaron Salter III, and Tanya Salter. Lieutenant Salter also leaves behind a sister, Cashel Durham, nieces, nephews, cousins, friends, and his beloved pets. Geraldine Talley, known as Jerry to her friends and family, was 62 years old. She was a native of Grove Hill, Alabama, moving to Buffalo in 1971 with her family. She earned her degree in secretarial science from Bryan and Stratton College, eventually working for a nonprofit assisting people with mental illness and related substance abuse issues. She was famous for her love of baking and for sharing her creations with others. Her specialty was banana pudding cakes. When she was at Tops, she was shopping for a few ingredients for her weekly waterfront picnic with her fiancé. She left behind her children, Genesia Smith and Mark Talley Jr., stepdaughter, Marquise Jacobs, 3 sisters and 1 brother, her beloved fiancé, Gregory Allen, and numerous family and friends. Catherine Massey. Catherine Massey, known to many simply as Cat, was 72 years old. Cat worked for 40 years for Blue Cross Blue Shield and was always committed to the betterment of our community. She worked to educate kids on healthy diets, to rid our nation of gun violence, and to beautify her neighborhood. In fact, she was a longtime campaigner against gun violence, founding We Are Women Warriors with her beloved friends Betty Jean Grand and Dr. Eva Doyle. She was a regular contributor to the Buffalo Challenger and the Buffalo Criterion. Kat was also an active resident in Buffalo's Fruit Belt neighborhood, helping to form a block club and successfully lobbying for the creation of a new public park on her home street of Cherry Street. She was survived by her dear siblings, Barbara Mapps and Warren Massey, as well as her adored nieces and nephews, Adriana Massey, Damone Mapps, Damian Mapps, Darrell, Demetrius, and Dawn Massey, numerous great nieces and nephews, and 1 great niece. Roberta A. Drury. Roberta Drury was 32 years old. She was originally from Cicero, New York, attending Cicero North Syracuse High School. It was her love for family that brought her to Buffalo, relocating to our community to help care for her brother who was recovering from his battle with leukemia. Her greatest passion was family, highlighted by their annual trips to Wildwood, New Jersey. She was survived by her dear mother, Leslie Van Giesen, father, Philip Drury, grandfather, John Traeger, her beloved siblings, Christopher Moyer, Daniel Moyer, Amanda Drury, Nicole Van Giesen, and Brett Van Giesen, as well as numerous aunts, uncles, nephews, cousins, and friends. Hayward Patterson. Hayward Patterson was 67 years old. He was in his truck, waiting for a friend. He drove to Tops to pick up groceries, something he did often. He was a deacon at the State Tabernacle Church of God in Christ in Buffalo, located on Glenwood Avenue, reflecting his devotion and faith in God. According to his fellow churchgoers, Deacon Patterson was often the first one to arrive and the last to leave. He helped open and close the church, clean, shovel. He volunteered in every capacity, including in the church's soup kitchen, Plate of Love ministry. He is survived by his 3 children, Deanna, Sharita, and Jake, his beloved wife, Terza, as well as his parents, siblings, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and many more. Celestine Cheney. Celestine Cheney was 65 years old. When she was killed, she was out purchasing ingredients for strawberry shortcake for her family. And she was a fighter, surviving 3 aneurysms and breast cancer. Celestine was a graduate of Fosdick Maston Girls Vocational High School, where she learned to sew, later attending Bryan Stratton College for Business Administration. She worked at several large manufacturers, including M. Weil and New Era Cap. She attended Elim Christian Fellowship Church in Buffalo. And she was survived by her beloved partner and fiance, Raymond Johnson, her only son, Wayne Donnell Jones, 9 grandchildren, Wayne Donnell Jones Jr., Kayla Jones, Sharon Reed, Shayna Jones, Donnell Jones, Nasir Jones, Dominique Brown, Latifah Johnson, and Latoya Bao. 9 great-grandchildren, 1 sister, Joanne Daniel, and a host of nieces and nephews. To conclude my remarks, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that my colleagues and those in the gallery join me in a moment of silence on behalf of the beautiful souls who were stolen from the city of Buffalo 2 years ago today, on May 14th, 2022. Thank you.
Does the gentleman yield back?
Mr. Speaker, I now yield my time. It is my honor to yield my time to my colleague, Rep. Clyburn from South Carolina, who is here. I recognize my colleague, Rep. Clyburn, the sponsor of the Enhanced Background Checks Act, to speak.
Here, as we mark the second anniversary of the tragic events that unfolded on May 14th, 2022, at the Tops Supermarket in Buffalo, New York, it's a solemn reminder of the devastating impact of hate-fueled violence. This was not just an attack on innocent individuals, but an assault on the very fabric of the Buffalo community. A self-professed white supremacist targeted the Tops supermarket and drove more than 200 miles to get there. Because of its location in a predominantly black community, his actions took 10 precious lives. There were sons, daughters, parents, and friends whose absences continued to be felt deeply. The pain New Yorkers feel is known all too well by us down in South Carolina. In 2015, a white supremacist walked into the Mother Emanuel, the oldest African-American Methodist church in the South. Dylann Roof targeted that church because of its historical significance. He worshiped with them. He prayed with them. He was welcome into their Bible study with open arms. And he repaid that kindness by opening fire on the innocent group of worshipers, killing 9. These horrific acts must serve as a stark reminder of the dangerous consequences of online radicalization, racism, and the all too easy access to weapons of war. The Buffalo shooter's online writings praised Roof's actions. And although he obtained his weapon legally, the shooter made illegal modifications to make them much more deadly. In the case of Mother Emanuel AME Church, a simple background check could have helped to prevent the tragedy. Roof never should have been allowed to buy a gun, but a deadly loophole in our federal laws allowed him to do just that. If the required background checks process takes more than 3 business days, the Charleston loophole allows firearms to be transferred to buyers before the process is complete. That's how Roof was able to get a gun. I've introduced legislation to close the Charleston loophole, which the gentleman from New York has joined as a co-sponsor, and I thank him for that. That only solves one piece of the puzzle. Our communities have emerged from these tragedies stronger than ever. But white supremacy is a scourge on our society that we must confront head on. We must join together to push back against the harmful ideologies that tear us apart. Representative Kennedy, thank you for your leadership, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time. I move now that the House do now adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate.